We are talking Nightmare on 34th Street, directed, written, produced and edited by James Crowe. Of course, that title is a spin on a very famous Christmas movie. And this movie is a low-budget Christmas horror comedy anthology movie. And yeah, it features some kind of appearances from some famous British glamour models, including Lucy Pinder and Dani Thompson, along with a bunch of other kind of people as well. It effectively has a wraparound story, a kind of vignette intro, and kind of 4 stories that kind of fill up the runtime effectively. Now the stories are relatively similar. They are effectively Christmas-themed home invasion stories, all the kind of a slasher kind of movie kind of antagonist at the end of the day. There's not really anything sort of supernatural or paranormal here. It's kind of all like Christmas killer types of one form or another. So the movies have a somewhat similarity between them. And then we have the kind of the wraparound where it's effectively this kind of Santa Claus sort of character telling this kid these kind of various kind of stories and things like this. So what can we say that works in this movie's favour? Now, we do have to bear in mind this is clearly a very low budget movie, and as such there are certain restrictions in place here. But what I would say is I think this movie, when it leans into the comedy, I would say it's at its most effective. Now the comedy is actually kind of quite interesting because it's like this smutty British style kind of comedy that you may have seen in movies like the Carry On films. Now, albeit this is a kind of very low budget, you know, Christmas horror film, so it's not exactly the same, but it kind of has that sort of, you know, lots of puns, lots of kind of funny turn of phrase, you know, using these kind of famous Christmas kind of sayings or songs, and then kind of substituting kind of words to make them kind of like dark or perverse or something like that. You know, a little bit of kind of sexual innuendo, things like this here and there. So it has that weird kind of like Carry On movie kind of style feel to it, be it a very low budget Christmas horror comedy movie. So I did find it a little bit funny from time to time. There's also some kind of self-referential kind of like horror movie homages and things like this, and little winks to the kind of the audience. For example, the movie opens with this sequence where we have this kind of, a bit like The Strangers, like the movie The Strangers, but with a Christmas themed twist to it. And that is the one that features Dani Thompson. And then when that story finishes, we pull out and we see that there's this Santa Claus sort of character watching a film, a DVD, with this kid. And the kid's complaining like, oh, I don't know if I want to watch kind of like these scary films. And then Santa kind of quite amusingly says, oh, this movie's been banned in like 15 countries and things like this. It's just the uncut edition. And it just reminds me of some of the discourse that I see in kind of other YouTubers when they talk about, you know, horror films and getting these, you know, uncut versions and banned copies and things like this, which I kind of found quite kind of funny. And as I said, there are some funny moments just in the movie where we have, you know, characters getting kind of killed by various kind of Christmas decorations and little kind of like puns about kind of Christmas related kind of kills and things like that. So it does have this kind of darkly comic vein kind of running through it, which I think is, although it's not laugh out loud funny, I do think that it has like an amusing kind of like feel to the film for the most part. If I'm honest, that part of the film is when it's at its strongest. It's strongest when it is a comedy, because I think when it's trying to be either dramatic or a true horror, that's when the movie fails a little bit, which we'll come on to in just a moment. So when it's trying to be funny, that's when it's at its strongest. So in a way, I wish the movie led more into that and had more of a kind of comedic overtone rather than just kind of like innuendos and puns kind of, you know, sprinkled between. The movie has quite a large kind of cast because it is an anthology. There's a lot of kind of child actors here. And it is nice to kind of see a couple of familiar faces in here if you're familiar with kind of, you know, the low budget British kind of indie actors and things. There's a few you'll recognise here. In particular, I would say Lucy Pinder, who was quite famous once upon a time as a kind of glamour model here in the UK. And the story that has her as the kind of the main character, I would say, is the most interesting in regards to a plot, because it has the most interesting twist to it that kind of like makes sense, if that makes sense. Now, all the films try to have a little bit of a surprise with them, but I feel this was plot-wise the strongest. Now, the stories are all somewhat kind of similar, so I'm not going to go through them each because they're kind of similar. It's effectively a family being, or a household of people being kind of threatened by a Christmas-style themed home invader of sorts, and it's variations of the kind of the same thing. So the movie is a little bit too similar for an anthology. This is now where we look at maybe what doesn't work. I think having an anthology, these type of films benefit when there's variety in the storytelling. And this one, like I said, the stories are all very similar to one another. It's kind of the same story, just with a little bit of different kind of window dressing ultimately. All of the movies are kind of like, have a kind of slasher feel to it, which might be great if you're a slasher fan, but you know, you might be hankering for something else. I mean, there's some different plot points in it, but they are broadly sort of similar. The real issue here, I feel, is the extreme lack of budget, because it really does feel, from the opening shot, you'll just feel like it's a very, very cheap film. Now, again, if you're like me, you don't mind necessarily kind of like low budget movies, and in fact, you kind of quite enjoy these kind of like little scene movies there, because they sometimes have these kind of like little winning gems in them. One of the things I feel people would be most disconcerted with this movie is, I have to be honest with you, is the acting is not good for the most part. And I would say there are times when it is horrendously bad from certain kind of performances. I'm not going to point out individuals, but, you know, if you're looking at a kind of a, because it is a large cast, if you're looking at the amount of actors in here, I would say, unfortunately, the performances are not strong. Now, you can argue they're trying to be a kind of somewhat ironic, self-referential kind of style movie, and there is a degree of that, and there are certain characters like our main Santa guy, for example, who I feel does a little better. But there are some performances here that are actually quite like, you know, it makes you feel uncomfortable watching it, because thinking, oh god, this is not a good performance, you know, not good even for a low budget movie. It's quite difficult to sit through it sometimes. So the acting here, to be kind, is variable, shall we say. Variable. Very variable. So there's that. The movie's editing is also quite poor. Now, James Crow, who is the man behind this movie, was obviously, as I mentioned, the director, the writer, the producer, the editor, probably had a bunch of other kind of roles behind the scenes as well. And it's often the case where there's one person who is the kind of the driving force between a movie. Sometimes can have a little singular vision and doesn't really take feedback from like a producer or something. And I don't know if that's the case with here, but I feel there could have been some choices that were made that may have made this movie a bit more easier to watch in regards to certain aspects through the directing. So I have to be honest with you, I think that some of the directing is fairly poor here. At times, not all the way through. And the editing as well is a bit ropey. And even sometimes it's a little confusing what you're watching, because more than one occasion where a character will be watching a film on TV, and the movie, bear in mind, we've had this wraparound story, then it kind of goes into like a story segment, and then that story segment goes into like something they're watching on TV, and thinking, oh, what am I watching? You know, it just flicks to like a sequence, and it's not like it's like there's TV lines on it, so you can tell they're watching TV. It's a little bit kind of like the transitions aren't brilliant. So I feel the movie isn't particularly kind of well sort of put together on a kind of a technical basis, and sometimes, not all the time, like I said, I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag here. It's a little bit, maybe it stays a little bit longer than you want. I think maybe they could have had one less story and make it a bit more of a punchy movie, to be honest with you. And it doesn't help the movies are so similar. I mean, again, it could have been that there could have been a little bit more of a difference in regards to the stories here, because they are just too similar to one another. So overall, I feel this movie could have led more into the comedy, and I think it might have been a bit more of a memorable film in some ways. But as such, I think it's only a part of this movie, and the rest of it, that kind of you lose stuff because of this, the poor acting, unfortunately. So the dramatic stuff doesn't really kind of come through. The horror, I don't think, is particularly kind of well realised. It's very cheap, you know, kills are off screen, things like this. Again, because of budgetary restraints, they're too similar and a little bit too silly at times. So, to be honest with you, unless you are just a huge fan of just low-budget festive movies, or you like kind of like these you know, glamour models, and you want to see them on screen, you know, it's not a particularly kind of great movie, I would say, as a kind of a recommendation here. In actual fact, like, I'll be honest with you, I've got this on a 3 out of 10 because I actually found it a somewhat poorly put together movie as a whole. So yeah, it's a 3 out of 10 for me. It wasn't a particularly strong one in my opinion. Would you see it? Have you seen it? Please do let me know. Leave me a comment and what your thoughts are, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.